Thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here and to see so many people concerned about this issue. But I do just want to start off by congratulating Natalie for her recent successes. I watched her briefly on the Andrew Marr show, and he made a point which I thought was very important to me personally, which I think she's the first party leader, female party leader, to succeed another female party leader. So that's wonderful. And then, of course, we know the doubling of the size of the party. But of course, I think what's really fundamentally important too is the political stand that the Green Party is taking along with other smaller parties too, not just ploughing a furrow on their own, but working together with Plaid Cymru and the Scottish Nationalist Party as an anti-austerity coalition, as they describe themselves, fighting back against the Tory and Labour cuts agenda, but also saying that actually, if there's a minority Labour government, we might consider supporting you, but we certainly won't support you on anything if you don't change your position on Trident. So that's an incredibly powerful and important decision to take. And it's that kind of principled stand that can actually help to make fundamental change in our society. I mean, for decades or more, we've been really held back by the first past the post system and all the kind of establishment tricks and so on that come around elections. I think now, with these developments, with the changes in Scotland, we're in a position where politics can fundamentally change. And whatever parties we're in, or whatever movements and organisations, I believe we all have to work together to try and bring about that change and make sure it lasts. It can't just be a flash in the pan. It's got to be something that lasts. And Trident is absolutely central to that, Britain's nuclear weapon system. Now, for a variety of reasons, this is going to be a general election issue. Labour and the Tories have been trying to keep it off the agenda, but it is going to be an issue in the general election. I don't know if many of you have noticed on Facebook or Twitter today, but tomorrow in Parliament there is actually going to be a debate. It's been called by the SNP, Plaid and the Greens, and the debate and vote is we should not be renewing Trident. And that's the first time that this issue has actually been debated in Parliament, in a proper debate in the House, since 2007, when Parliament first agreed to go ahead with the first steps of Trident replacement. So that's really important. And if you have an opportunity later on to tweet or message to your MP, please do say to them, when you go into that House tomorrow, you have to vote against Trident replacement, otherwise you're not getting my vote, you're not going to get many people's votes as a result. So we do have that opportunity to make that change pretty immediately. Now, as Natalie has said, the decision on whether or not to replace Trident, not just the kind of design which has been going on, but actually the decision on whether or not to start cutting the metal, making the subs, that is going to be taken in early 2016. It's going to cost over £100 billion in total. That's the manufacturing and it's the lifetime cost of sustaining it. Not surprisingly, at this time of austerity, the majority of the population is opposed to the replacement of Trident. I mean, when you think of all the other things that money could be spent on, it's a kind of no-brainer that you would cut that and not other things. In fact, CND's most popular campaigning slogan is NHS, not Trident. I mean, when you see what's been happening with the A&E departments, it makes perfect sense. Let's not have nuclear weapons. Let's have the facilities and the health service and jobs and education. Free education, for example, would be something that we could afford instead. And actually, that question of spending goes beyond just the kind of normal social spending that we would probably be concerned about. It goes to the extent that even people in the military say, actually, we don't want Trident replacement. If we're going to spend money on military spending, we should spend it on boots, we should spend it on housing for troops, a whole range of other military spending. Many of you may be pacifists or completely against any military spending, but it's really interesting for us to see generals, former field marshals, all that kind of thing, coming on board and saying, actually, Trident is militarily useless. It's not just moral obscenity, it's also militarily useless too. So the extent, the kind of broad alliance against Trident isn't just like the usual suspects, it comes from extensively across society. One of the things that many people highlight with regard to Trident is the kind of complete lack of democracy about it. I've said that the decision has not yet been taken, yet the current government is spending money month on month for Trident replacement. I mean, there was a report to Parliament at the end of December, actually, the Defence Minister kind of slipped it in on the last day, and he said, oh, there's a new report, you can go and read it in the library. He didn't actually say what the contents were, not surprisingly, because the contents actually said that they'd spent £250 million up front on things to build Trident with, even though Parliament hadn't yet made a decision. So this kind of lack of democracy is a really important factor in the whole kind of military industrial framework, but also particularly around Trident. There are vested interests there that we also have to be alert to too. The American companies, British companies as well, that are involved in making and building the submarines and the weapons. You know, they have vested interests in getting this through Parliament too. The other danger, of course, which we've seen with other big military projects, is that they say, oh, well, actually, we've spent so much money on it already, we're not actually going to cancel it now, it's too expensive to cancel it. We saw that with these aircraft carriers with no aircrafts on, you know. And we don't want to have a situation where they say, well, sorry, okay, we don't want Trident replacement, but we spent so much money on it already, we have to go ahead. So we have to be very alert to these things, and kind of scrutiny of what's going on in Parliament and what's going on in government is really important for us as a campaign, but for all of us, because it's our money that's going on it. You know, that has to be very much out in the open. Natalie touched on why do we have it. We hear all kinds of reasons, that it's an insurance policy, that, you know, we live in an uncertain world and all that kind of thing. I think you mentioned status, and that's one of the things that is something that politicians always do come back to. I don't know if any of you have ever read Tony Blair's autobiography, but in there he was talking about 2007 when he put the white paper to Parliament about replacing Trident, and he said in there, well, I looked at it from both sides. You know, obviously you must have read CND's papers as well, that's good. He said, I looked at it from both sides had a good argument. I could have come down on either side, but in the end I decided we had to replace it because of Britain's standing in the world. You know, we can't not have nuclear weapons. And to me, that seems like the worst possible reason to spend £100 billion on something, because you think somebody else is going to be impressed, because it makes it makes Britain somehow a heavy hitter, you know, in all the kind of foreign policy adventures that bring disaster that Natalie's also referred to. But it's quite interesting if you look at government defence policies, how the kind of whole thing of Trident doesn't really fit anymore. In 2010, the current government, published its national security strategy. They did a kind of few-month survey of what they thought the threats to Britain were, and they actually concluded that state-on-state nuclear war wasn't a tier 1 threat anymore, and they downgraded it. And they said actually tier 1 threats are things like terrorism, climate change, pandemic, organised crime, cyber warfare. So they downgraded nuclear weapons, but they didn't actually then question it in the Strategic Defence Review. They carried on having it there with all this money allocated, even though they'd downgraded the risks associated. You know, complete example of unjoined up thinking from our politicians. You know, so even in their own assessment, we don't actually need it as much as they say we need other forms of military spending. International concern, Natalie's touched on that as well. You know, internationally, the demand for disarmament is growing exponentially, not just from campaigns, not just from civil society, but from states across the world. In the last year or two, there's been a huge initiative called the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons Initiative. And over 150 countries now worldwide have been meeting together to say, actually, you've got to scrap nuclear weapons globally. There's only 9 countries with them. You've got to get rid of them. They present such a terrible humanitarian danger to the rest of the world that you can't carry on with it anymore. That's the view of the majority of the global population. And it's time that our government got in line with that. The majority of the British population doesn't want it, the majority of the global community doesn't want it, they could destroy the world many times over. You know, what's it for? It's got to end. Now we have the opportunity to really get our voices heard on this. There's the kind of whole pressure building up that I've referred you to. I'd like to suggest just 2 things that you could do. You could do many more things, but just 2 things I'd like to ask you to consider doing to help bring this about. One is, in the run-up to the elections, email every single one of your candidates in your constituency. It won't take you more than a few minutes to do that, because if you go to the CND website, it's all set up for you there. You just put in your postcode and it will all be available to you to do with a few clicks of the button. And each of your candidates from all parties will then know they won't get your vote if they support Trident, and they need to be aware of this because the vote is coming up. So I would please ask you to do that. And then, if you're free on Saturday, come and do one of those creative types of activity that Natalie was talking about. You can come along and help wrap up Parliament, wrap up the MOD in pink peace scarf. What could be nicer than that? So come along on Saturday if you're free, meet us at midday outside the MOD and come and join a very interesting and enjoyable protest. And make your voices heard. Thank you.